You need a wife. And I need a dad. That's what the little girl said to the giant cowboy words, so small they could have been lost in the wind. But somehow they weren't. They reached the man and stopped him cold. Sable Ridge, Montana Territory. Autumn, 1877. Morning fog rolled through the ridges like the ghost of winter, curling low over the bones of the land. The pines stood tall and silent witnesses to a world that had seen more blood than rain down below. Through thickets of wild thistle and the gray hush of dawn came the slow beat of hooves. Jackson Clay rode without hurry, the kind of slow that meant a man had nowhere to be, or nowhere left he wanted to go. He was huge, a mountain of a man with shoulders, like cut stone, and a long coat streaked with trail dust. His hat sat low, shadowing eyes that had forgotten how to hope. His horse, a brown gelding, matched his silence. The animal moved with a steady rhythm, as if it too understood that peace wasn't quiet. It was just what came after. There was nothing left to say. There wasn't a path. Jackson followed the land itself, old instinct, faded memory, and the faint scent of cedar smoke that wasn't really there anymore. 5 miles west, the town of Sable Ridge waited a crooked patch of wood and dust, but he rarely went there unless he absolutely had to. The less he spoke, the longer people left him alone. That suited him fine. But that morning, the silence didn't stay quiet. As Jackson passed a scatter of rocks near a narrow ravine, he heard something that didn't belong to the wind. It was faint, a small shaking sound, a child's cry. He reined in hard. His horse snorted, ears twitching. Jackson slid down, boots sinking into dew-soaked grass. The cry came again, thin. Scared, human. He followed it, every sense awake now, scanning the brush until he spotted a patch of ground trampled flat near a cluster of stones. Beneath them, hidden behind weeds and broken boards, yawned a dry well, its rotted cover half collapsed. Jackson crouched beside it and peered down. There, clinging to the rough wall with bleeding hands, was a little girl. Her dress was torn at the hem. Her knees scraped raw, and brown curls stuck to her mud-smeared face. When she saw the shadow of a man above, she froze, eyes wide, breath caught halfway between terror and hope. Jackson didn't speak. He just reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a coil of rope, and tied a loop with practiced ease. His voice, when it came, was rough and low. "Hold on, little one." The girl hesitated only a second, then wrapped trembling fingers around the rope. Jackson braced himself against a stump and began to pull, slow, careful, steady. Halfway up, she slipped. A small scream tore through the air. Jackson grunted, locked his arms, and held, his muscles bunched beneath the worn coat, veins standing out against skin weathered by sun and years. Inch by inch, he drew her up until her small hand reached the rim. He caught her beneath the arms and lifted her out. She weighed next to nothing. For a moment, they both stayed still, the child coughing weakly, the man breathing hard but even. She was filthy mud on her lashes, blood on her elbows, and fear in her eyes. Jackson's face was half hidden by shadow, but she could see enough to know he wasn't like the men who shouted or hit. He was still, quiet, like a mountain that might move only when the earth itself told it to. The girl stared at him, studying the silence. Then, with a tiny, hoarse voice that barely carried, she said, "You need a wife." Jackson blinked, unsure he'd heard right. She tilted her head, eyes locked on his. "And I need a dad." For a long moment, nothing moved. Not the grass, not the horse, not even the clouds drifting above them. Then something cracked inside the man, quietly, invisibly. Something buried under years of dust and pain shifted, like old ice breaking on a thawing river. His breath hitched. His eyes, dry from too many lonely miles, burned. And for the first time in a long, long while, The wet that gathered there wasn't from the wind. Later that same morning, the town of Sable Ridge creaked awake. Wooden storefronts leaned into the wind. The blacksmith's hammer rang out steady. And the smell of coal smoke mixed with the tongue of horses' Dot. It wasn't much, but to Mara Jennings, it was far enough. Dot. She stood at the edge of Main Street, dust on her boots. Tears dried on her cheeks, and the hem of her skirt torn from a night's hard ride. Her little girl, Ellie, was asleep in the saddle, her small head tucked against Mara's chest like a fragile secret. Mara hadn't slept in days. Dot at 28. She carried the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from travel, the kind that lived in the bones. Her once smooth face was drawn and pale, and her eyes clear. Cold blue never stopped watching the shadows. Once, long ago, she'd been a field nurse. She'd patched bleeding soldiers under canvas tents, her hands steady even when her heart wasn't. Her husband, Corporal Samuel Rains, had died in the Battle of Spenia. A good man, a kind man, and his death had left her with nothing but a child and a grave. After the war, she drifted, town to town. No place safe enough to start again until Lyle Jennings found her. Lyle had served with her husband. At first, he'd offered her help, shelter, food, protection. But protection turned to possession. His hands became cuffs. His voice became law. There was no ring, no vows, only bruises and silence. One night, while Ellie cried in the next room, Mara had looked into a cracked mirror, touched the cut on her cheek, and realized she'd die there if she stayed. Dot. So she ran. Now she'd made it to Sable Ridge, a dot on a map, a whisper of safety. She tied her horse outside the mayor's office, gathered her shawl, and lifted Ellie from the saddle. Dot. The little girl stirred, blinking awake. Mara kissed her forehead. "It's all right, baby. We're here." She started toward the office steps, but stopped. Voices drifted from around the corner. One deep, gravel rough. The other small, high, familiar. Ellie's voice. Mara's pulse jumped. She stepped around the building and froze. There, sitting on the back steps, was a giant of a man. Broad-shouldered, coat worn to the seams, hat tipped low. And beside him, perched on the step, was Ellie, mud still on her dress. Curls tangled, eyes bright shouting softly. Her tiny hand resting on his massive knee, as if it belonged there. The sight nearly stopped Mara's heart. The man, Jackson Clay, turned his head slowly. Their eyes met. His gaze was steady, not harsh, not soft, just real. For a breath, Mara couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then Ellie turned, saw her, and squealed, "Mama!" Mara ran, dropped to her knees, and caught her child in her arms. She buried her face in Ellie's hair, tears spilling freely. When she looked up, Jackson was standing. He towered over them, hat in one hand, unsure what to do with the other. "Thank you," Mara whispered, her voice trembling. "For saving her. I'm her mother." Jackson nodded once. No words. Just that quiet presence that filled the space like a promise. And in that moment, Mara Jennings, runaway widow, mother on the edge of breaking, felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't feel afraid. Asterisk, they called him Giant Clay in town. Not out of mockery, but respect. The kind of respect men earn when they work hard, fight harder, and keep their mouths shut about both. Few knew his real story. Fewer dared to ask. He lived alone up on the ridge, past the cedar trail, in a cabin that leaned slightly west, as if it too had grown tired of standing. Jackson Clay had built that cabin with his own hands, back when hope still had a heartbeat before war, before graves. Before everything burned. He didn't keep company. No wife, no children, no dog, just a gray gelding, a rifle, and ghosts that refused to stay buried. The townsfolk had stopped asking questions after the first year. But some remembered. He'd once worn blue Captain Jackson Clay of the Union Artillery, known for his calm under fire, cursed for his silence after. They said he'd been a wall in battle, unbreakable, unmoving. But walls fall 2.2 months after Appomattox. Jackson had taken leave to go home, to surprise his wife and little girl. But home was gone. Drunk militia had mistaken his cabin for that of a Confederate sympathizer. By the time he arrived, it was ash and silence. He never shouted, never wept. He just buried them beneath a dogwood tree and walked away from the army, from the country, from life itself, until the day he heard a little girl's cry from the bottom of a well. 2 days after rescuing Ellie, Jackson found something tucked beneath his saddle strap, a small handkerchief stitched with crooked yellow petals. A daisy, a child's work. He turned it over in his hand for a long time, then folded it gently and set it in a tin box beside an old tintype photo of a smiling woman and a toddler who would never grow older. The next morning, before dawn, he rode into town. He didn't knock on doors. He just climbed onto the roof of Mara Jennings's rented cabin and began fixing the leak. He'd noticed when it rained when he was done. He left without a sound at sunrise. Mara opened her door to find a small sack of oats on the step. The next morning, it was flour. Then dried apples. No notes. No words. Just quiet acts. At first, she watched the roof with suspicion, then with gratitude. And soon, when she left her lamp burning late into the night, it wasn't out of fear anymore. It was because she knew someone up on the ridge was still awake. Sable Ridge did its best impression of cheerful once a month. Traders rattled in from the outlying ranches, slinging pelts over rails and stacking jars of preserves on rough tables. The street turned into a crooked fair burlap, barrels, hot coffee steaming in tin cups. Kids wove between wagon wheels like minnows in a current. And somebody always burned sugar, because that's just what happens when a town tries to smell sweet. Mara Jennings set up her little table near the hitching posts. She arranged hand-rolled bandages in neat rows and lined up bottles of cough syrup and willow bark tonic, each stopper tied with twine. Her hands moved with a nurse's muscle memory, steady, economical, but her eyes never stopped scanning. Old habits. Necessary ones. Ellie sat on a stool beside her, scuffing a stick through dust and drawing lopsided daisies. Every few breaths she'd look up, just to make sure her mother was still there. Mara answered with a small nod every time. A promise made with eyes. For one soft minute, the day felt normal, sun-warm, breeze easy. The ache inside her lowered its voice, and then the crowd shifted. It wasn't loud. It was the opposite, like wind dropping out of the pines all at once. A hush that rolled in and pressed on the skin. Mara felt it before she turned. He was there. Lyle. Jennings swaggered through the gap between two tables, spurs ticking like a clock you couldn't stop. Hat low, jaw dark with stubble. That smile, the one that never reached his eyes, leaned lazy across his face, as if nothing in the world could deny him anything. Well now, he drawled, stopping in front of her table. Ain't this cozy? Mara reached for Ellie without thinking, pulling her close. She kept her voice level, the way you talk to a rattler you can't yet see. Leave. Lyle's gaze flicked down the rows of jars and bandages, then back to her. You run all the way out here to play doctor? Selling roots and ribbon to wives who can't afford real medicine? He clicked his tongue. You always were good at tending broken things, Mara. Shame you forgot who you belong to. Ellie flinched at the sound of his voice. Her small fingers slid from Mara's grasp, and in a burst of animal fear, she bolted, but she didn't run toward her mother. She ran toward the far edge of the market, toward a man standing calm as a tree at the leather goods stall, a coiled lariat in one hand and a warm bridle in the other. Jackson Clay looked up just as Ellie slammed into his leg and hid behind him like she'd known how to do it her whole life. He set the bridle down, turned, placed himself between her and the danger without a word. Lyle stalked after, that too wide smile finally cracking around the edges when he realized exactly who he was walking toward. He stopped 15 paces away. His hand hovered near the pistol on his belt. The market held its breath. A baby somewhere hiccuped, then went silent, as if even infants knew certain moments were not theirs to disturb. Mara reached them just as Lyle took another step. Jackson raised one hand. Just enough. The air seemed to harden around that simple gesture. Lyle wasn't a man who feared fists. He understood fists. He owned fists. But the look in Jackson Clay's eyes, steady, unblinking, a kind of quiet that had survived fire, was worse than any threat. Lyle's grin thinned into something sharp. "You think a big shadow makes you a wall?" Jackson finally spoke, voice low and iron rough. "No, but it makes shade. She gets to stand in it." Rage flickered across Lyle's face, bright and stupid. He spat in the dust. "This ain't finished." Jackson's hand didn't move, but his tone did just a degree colder. "It is for today." A long beat. Then Lyle backed away, cursing under his breath, pushing through the people who pretended they weren't watching. The street exhaled. Mara dropped to her knees, wrapping Ellie up so tight the child squeaked. Relief hit so hard it left her shaky. When she lifted her head, Jackson was already crouched. He pulled a folded handkerchief from his coat and with unexpected gentleness wiped the dirt from Ellie's cheek. The cloth was soft and clean. Pressed flat. Mara recognized the stitching. The daisy. She looked up stunned. "You kept it?" Jackson gave one spare nod. No speech, no shrug. Just yes. Something in Mara's chest loosened and broke at the same time. Tears burned her lashes. She didn't push them back. She was too tired to be stubborn with her own heart. "Thank you," she whispered. "For the handkerchief. For the shade. For the breath she could finally take." Jackson stood, tipped his hat once, and stepped aside still close enough to block the world if it charged again. The market's rhythm stuttered back to life, the clang of the blacksmith, a hawker yelling about dried peaches, children skittering through dust. But a new story moved under it all. The giant who didn't draw, the outlaw who retreated, the woman who didn't run. By evening, that story had company. Jed Harlan, the blacksmith, squinted through heat shimmer as Jackson stepped into the forge to buy horseshoe nails. "I know you," Jed said, half to himself. Then louder, like a man catching a memory by the tail, "Fourth Artillery. Captain Jackson Clay." The anvil seemed to swallow the sound that followed. Jackson didn't confirm. He didn't need to. He laid coin on the anvil and walked out. The doors creaked too loud in the cooling air. By supper time, Sable Ridge knew. It threaded porch to porch on whispers and whiskey. The giant had worn blue. The war was over, but some scars keep fresh like they know how to breathe. Word reached Mara before the lamps were lit. Mrs. Calhoun, who claimed to hate gossip but collected it like China passed it over the fence. Voice hushed, eyes bright. "Captain. Union Captain." Mara stood in her small kitchen, the wall suddenly too close. Samuel's last letter, edges frayed from being unfolded and refolded 100 nights, sat on the shelf like a brand. Her husband had died in gray. Jackson had fought in blue. The world tilted. Not violently, no, worse. Slowly. She did not sleep. At dawn. She was already on the trail, climbing toward the cabin that leaned west. Jackson was splitting wood when she appeared at the edge of the clearing, straight-backed, storm-eyed, her jaw set into a line that meant this conversation would not leave either of them as it found them. He set the axe aside and waited. "You fought for the North," she said, voice flat to keep it from breaking. He nodded once. "My husband died at Spotsylvania," she said. "Shot through the lung. He bled out on dirt that didn't care what side he was on. Jackson didn't flinch, didn't defend. He just took it like a man, letting the river slam into him until it finally tires itself out. Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. He disappeared into the dim interior of his cabin and returned with a small wooden box, edges worn smooth by hands that had needed something to hold on to. He offered it. Mara hesitated, then took it. Inside lay a tarnished officer's badge and a folded letter, the paper thin from time. The ink had paled, but the handwriting was sure graceful loops, steady lines. Asterisk, "My dearest Jack," it began. "If you are reading this, I am gone. Please don't chase the men who did this. Do not let vengeance take the rest of you. Leave long enough to remember joy. Laugh again. Love again. Your heart is soft as moonlight, no matter how much blood it has seen." Mara closed her eyes. The words touched something tender and terrible inside her. The part that wanted to be done with pain and the part that didn't trust. Happiness when it finally showed up. She folded the letter carefully and returned it to the box. For a heartbeat, she saw not the soldier who'd worn the opposite color, not the myth the town had made, but the man grieving, stubbornly breathing, holding a life together with rough hands and silence. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can't. Not yet. I have to keep Ellie safe from every ghost, including gentle ones." He didn't argue. He only inclined his head, as if he knew better than anyone how long grief could take to cross a room. Mara turned and walked away, the fog swallowing her. Jackson stood in the doorway, the box still warm from her touch, and let her go. Again. Night fell hard on Sable Ridge. Mara packed in the half-dark, silent, efficient, each fold measured. The saddlebag bulged against the doorframe, like a decision trying to leave without being noticed. Her coat hung on its peg, her courage somewhere under it. Ellie sat on the bed, small hands clutching the blanket. "Do we have to go?" she asked, voice so soft it almost wasn't there. Mara swallowed. "Sometimes the right thing isn't simple, baby. It is to me." Mara kissed her curls and tucked the quilt under her chin. "Sleep. We ride at first light." Ellie nodded. She did not sleep. When her mother's breathing finally evened out, the little girl slipped from bed, pulled on her boots, and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. She eased the door open like the night might squeal and tell on her. The cold bit hard. Frost crackled underfoot, the sound much too loud for a world this quiet, but Ellie kept walking. The trail to the ridge seemed taller in the dark, the trees leaning in as if to listen. She knew the way. Jackson woke before the knock. It wasn't sound, just the land going still. He grabbed his rifle by habit and opened the door to a small bundle shivering on his threshold. Ellie, lips blue, hands tucked beneath her chin like birds hiding their heads under wings. He dropped the rifle and scooped her up in one motion. Blankets, fire, hot stones wrapped in cloth to warm her feet. He moved like a man who remembered exactly what to do and had been waiting years for permission to do it again. Her eyes fluttered. "I found you," she murmured, words slurring around sleep. He sat on the stool beside the cot, unsure how to explain to a child how men fall apart and try not to. "Why'd you come?" he asked finally. "Because," she yawned, "you don't leave the people who hold you like you're precious." He looked away quickly, jaw tight. When he found his voice again, it wasn't much more than a scratch. "I had a daughter." Ellie's eyes opened wider. "Her name was June," he said. "She sang to the horses even when they pinned their ears." Fell asleep in the hay once, and had the nerve to dream about clouds, while I tore the place apart looking for her. A ghost of a smile crossed his face and was gone. I told her every day that I loved her, every single day. Then she's still with you, Ellie said simply, as if the world were that easy. Jackson didn't trust his voice. He just let the fire talk for a while, down at the edge of the porch. A shadow moved. Mara had woken to find Ellie's bed empty and followed small boot prints rimmed with frost up the trail. Panic cutting through sleep as clean as a blade. She reached the clearing and stopped, hidden by darkness and the soft glow spilling from the window dot inside. The giant sat bent close to her daughter, speaking with a voice that carried more ache than anger. He wasn't a soldier in that moment. He wasn't a legend either. He was a father without a child, learning how to be one again, because a brave little girl had decided it was time that Mara could have turned away. Pride said go. Fear said go. She didn't. She stayed. And the tight knot inside her chest slipped a fraction. Dawn found them like that Mara on the porch, torn between leaving and stepping inside. Jackson dozing in a chair beside the cot. Ellie sleeping warm at last, one small hand tucked into the giant's. The woods went quiet. Too quiet. Jackson woke to the kind of silence that meant trouble had paused to listen for itself. He stood, set Ellie's hand gently on the blanket, and crossed to the door. Mara, he said, not turning. Cellar. She didn't argue. He lifted the rug, swung the hatch open, and handed her a lantern and a rifle. Not a sound till I come back. What's coming? She whispered. Something that thinks it still owns you. He lowered the hatch, rolled the rug back, and was gone before the lamp could flare bright. They arrived 10 minutes later. Lyle and 2 men who smelled like coin more than courage. They dismounted hard, boots throwing up dust. The cabin sat quiet, shutters drawn like old eyes pretending to sleep. Lyle spat toward the porch. Clay, you think you can steal what's mine and sit pretty? Jackson answered from the tree line, not the house. You'd call a woman yours, in front of God, in the woods? He said, stepping into view. Hat low, rifle high. Lyle laughed. You're outgunned. Jackson didn't bother replying. The land did it for him. The first mercenary took a step and vanished with a scream, down into a pit masked by brush and thin sticks. The sound of a leg breaking carried like a snapped branch. The second pivoted, raising his rifle, but a rope jerked tight from somewhere above, and a row of logs barreled off a ridge, crashing through brush and slamming him into a pine with a thud that ended things quick. Smoke licked up from the dry grass where some fool had dropped a cigar. It spread, greedy. Lyle fired wild. A bullet burned across Jackson's arm. He hit the dirt, rolled behind the water trough, and came up already sighted. His single shot clipped Lyle's shoulder, spinning him to the ground. The woods crackled. Fire tasted the lower branches and liked it. Jackson limped forward, bleeding through his sleeve. Lyle crawled backward, eyes fevered with hatred strong enough to make a man stupid. She was mine, he hissed. Jackson's shadow fell over him. She never was. She was surviving you. Lyle groped for his gun. Jackson kicked it into the brush without looking where it landed. He turned and walked away, leaving the outlaw to the dirt, and the consequences. By the time townsfolk thundered in, drawn by smoke and shots, the flames had blistered the edges of the clearing. But the cabin stood untouched, and in front of it, steady as a fence post, stood Jackson Clay, shirt torn, arm bleeding, hat in hand, breath heavy, but even Mayor Calloway swung down from his horse, mouth open. Merciful heaven! Jackson! Jackson tipped his hat toward the trees where the mercenaries groaned and Lyle lay slumped. He didn't waste words. Behind him, the front door creaked. Mara stepped out. Ellie clutched close. She looked at the man between her family and the fireblood on his sleeve. Smoke curling behind him, and something finally settled in her eyes. Not just gratitude, recognition, the kind you give a man you plan to build a life beside. Asterisk, the next morning dawned pale and thin, as if the sky itself was still deciding whether it wanted to live through another day. Inside the cabin, the world felt quieter than it should have. Ellie lay bundled in quilts, cheeks flushed from the fever that had chased her all night. Mara sat beside her, dipping a cloth into cool water and pressing it gently to her daughter's brow. Jackson. Clay sat in a chair, pulled close to the bed, his elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the child. He hadn't moved for hours. The firelight flickered across his face, carving the lines of worry deeper. Outside, wind whispered through the trees, but here, time seemed to hold its breath. Ellie stirred, lashes fluttering. Her small fingers twitched against the blanket. Mara leaned in, her heart tripping over itself. The girl blinked once, twice, and found them both watching her. "Mama?" She whispered. "I'm right here, baby," Mara said, voice breaking with relief. And Ellie turned her head toward Jackson, and her lips curled into a weak, sleepy smile. "We're staying here forever, right?" Jackson's throat worked before he could find his voice. He reached out, his rough, scarred hand swallowing hers. "If your mama says so," he said softly. Mara's gaze met his. For once, the fear wasn't stronger than the truth inside her. "Do I have your word?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "You have more than that." He hesitated, then added, "You have me." The words hung there, plain and heavy. Not fancy, not rehearsed, but true. Mara's eyes shimmered. She looked down at Ellie, then back to the man who'd fought fire and ghosts for them. "Then yes," she said, barely breathing the word. Jackson's jaw tightened as he swallowed the flood of something he hadn't felt in years' hope. He looked around the small room, its cracked walls and smoke-stained rafters, and said, "Do I have your permission? To build something that won't burn down this time?" Mara's breath caught. She nodded once, then again harder. "Yes, please." And for the first time since either of them could remember, the tears that came weren't born from sorrow. They were the kind that washed away the past instead of drowning in it. 2 months later, spring came like forgiveness. Snow melted into the soil, rivers swelled with new life, and the valley turned green again. The land itself seemed to breathe easier. Up on the ridge, Jackson rebuilt his cabin, not because it had fallen apart, but because it deserved something new. He tore it down to the bones and started over, his calloused hands shaping every board, carving every beam, sealing every seam against wind and rain. When he worked, he didn't hum or talk much, but his silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of purpose. Mara helped where she could, rolling up her sleeves, hauling wood, sweeping sawdust from the floor that was slowly becoming theirs. She filled the shelves with glass jars, dried herbs, bandages, salves, each one a small piece of her old life that didn't hurt to keep anymore. Sometimes she sang while she worked, soft hymns from the days before the war, the ones she used to hum while mending wounds under lantern light. The sound drifted out the open windows and into the fields, where Ellie chased butterflies through tall grass. Jackson would stop what he was doing just to listen. He'd never say it, but that voice that was home. By late May, a house stood proud on the ridge, framed by birch trees that stretched tall and white against the sky. Jackson had even built a small porch, sturdy and wide enough for a rocking chair, and a little girl's drawings chalked across the planks. Mara planted a garden near the riverbank mint, sage, wild onions, and a single row of daisies. Ellie helped her water them every morning. Always careful not to drown the flowers. One evening, Jackson came back from town with something bundled in canvas. Mara raised an eyebrow. What's that? He unwrapped it slowly. A tiny saddle, crafted for a child. Figured she's earned her own horse by now, he said. Ellie squealed so loud that even the crows took flight. Jackson smiled small, shy, the kind of smile that felt rusty from disuse, but real all the same. The next day, he led Ellie's new mare, a gentle sorrel with white socks, out into the yard. You ride her, he said. She don't need much direction, just heart. Ellie beamed up at him. Like you? Jackson chuckled under his breath. Something like that. Mara stood by the porch, watching her daughter ride in crooked circles around the clearing, her laughter ringing against the hills. She turned to Jackson. You've given her more than she's ever had. Jackson's gaze followed the child. She gave me something too, he said quietly. What's that? He looked down at his hands. A reason to come back every day. When the wildflowers bloomed, they wed beneath the tallest birch. It wasn't a grand affair. No choir, no church bells. Just the mayor standing by with his hat in hand, grinning like a fool. The women of Sable Ridge had sewn Mara a dress, simple and white, with lace cuffs and a hem that brushed her boots. It wasn't perfect, but it fit her like forgiveness. Jackson wore a clean shirt, his best, pressed flat as he could manage. His hands trembled as he buttoned it that morning. Ellie stood between them, wearing a wreath of daisies she'd made herself, scattering petals into the air. When the mayor finished speaking, Jackson took Mara's hands in his. I thought I died in the war, he said softly, voice rough with emotion. Stopped breathing when the world burned down around me. But you and Ellie, he glanced down at the child, smiling up at him. You gave me air again, a reason to stay. And I swear, I'm not leaving this time. Mara's eyes filled. She pressed her forehead to his. You gave us back what it means to be safe, she whispered. Ellie threw her arms around both of them, giggling through tears. The people of Sable Ridge clapped and cheered, not politely, but the way folks do when they believe in what they're seeing. No orchestra played, just laughter, boots in the grass, the hum of new beginnings. That evening, as the sun melted into gold over the valley, 3 horses rode across the open meadow. Jackson, Mara, and Ellie, side by side. No destination, no hurry, just together. Their laughter rose with the dust behind them, echoing off the hills. From a distance, you could see the house smoke curling from the chimney, birch trees standing guard, the river glinting silver in the last light. A place not born of running, but of choosing to stay. Sometimes the heart doesn't return to where it began. It finds its way to where it's finally safe to rest. Jackson Clay had buried a family once. Mara Jennings had run from a life that wasn't hers. And little Ellie, she had simply believed that a man could be her father again. Together, they didn't just survive the Wild West. They built a home inside it. And as night fell across Sable Ridge, the last sound was the soft murmur of wind through the birch leaves, and the quiet laughter of a family that had learned, at last, how to stay. If this story touched your heart, hit like, share your favorite moment in the comments, and subscribe for more untamed, unforgettable Western love stories from the American frontier. Because here in Wild West Love Stories, bullets may miss, but hearts never do. Dawn broke pale and brittle over the ridge, sunlight catching on frost still clinging to the grass. Inside the cabin, it was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that followed both storms and miracles. Ellie lay beneath layers of quilts, her breathing shallow but even. Her cheeks still burned faintly with the fever that had haunted her through the night. Mara sat beside her, a damp cloth in hand, whispering to her little girl, though she wasn't sure Ellie could hear. Across the small room, Jackson Clay sat unmoving, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the child. His coat was torn and darkened with dried blood along one sleeve, but he hadn't mentioned it. He hadn't said a word since the fight, since the smoke, since the moment he'd stood between them and the fire like a wall built from something stronger than wood or flesh. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth wrapping the room in flickering gold. Ellie stirred, lashes trembling. Mara leaned closer, her heart hammering. Then slowly, the little girl's eyes opened blue, glassy, but awake. "Mama?" she whispered. Mara's throat closed. "I'm here, baby," she said softly. Then Ellie turned her head toward Jackson. Her smile was faint but certain. "We're staying here forever, right?" Jackson's breath caught in his chest. He reached out, his hand rough and scarred, and took her tiny fingers. "If your mama agrees," he murmured. Mara met his gaze. Her eyes were tired, rimmed red, but there was something new in them, a steadiness she hadn't worn in years. "Do I have your promise?" He nodded once. "You do. You've got all of it." She held his eyes, searching for something fear, maybe, or pity. She found neither. Only truth. "Then yes," she said. "We're staying." The words landed soft, like a prayer that had finally found its way home. Jackson looked down at Ellie's small hand curled in his, and then around the cabin that smelled of smoke and healing herbs. His voice was low when he said, "Do I have your permission to build something that won't burn down this time?" Mara blinked, tears spilling over before she could stop them. "Yes," she whispered. "Please." And for the first time in years, her tears didn't sting. They cleansed. Spring crept into the valley quiet as a secret. Snow melted into streams that glittered under sunlight, and the ground, once dead and gray, turned soft and green again. Up on the ridge, hammers and saws broke the stillness. Jackson Clay was rebuilding the cabin, not because the old one had fallen, but because it no longer fit the man he'd become. He worked from dawn till dusk, cutting boards by hand, driving nails steady and slow, every strike a promise. Sweat streaked the dust on his face, his shoulders broad under the weight of labor, but there was peace in the rhythm of it. Mara helped where she could. She hauled wood, swept sawdust, and wiped her forehead with the back of her arm like a ranch hand, her laughter startling even herself some days. Inside, she arranged shelves and jars, filling them with dried herbs, salves, and tonic bottles. She still made medicine, but now she did it humming old hymns, soft tunes she hadn't dared to sing since before the war. The sound floated through the open windows and carried into the fields, where Ellie played among the wildflowers, chasing butterflies and climbing low branches. Jackson would pause from his work just to listen. He'd never say it, but that voice, it was what home sounded like. By mid-May, the new cabin stood proud among the birch trees. Fresh-cut timber gleamed in the sunlight, and a small porch wrapped around the front like open arms. Jackson leaned against the post one evening, rolling a cigarette but not lighting it. Mara stepped out, a shawl around her shoulders, and smiled faintly. "You rebuilt more than a house," she said. He looked out toward the horizon. "Maybe so." Ellie burst from the yard, curls flying, and held up something behind her back. "Close your eyes." Jackson did as told. When he opened them again, she was grinning ear to ear, holding a small flower-crowned daisies, clover, and crooked stems woven with too much love and not enough skill. "For you," she said proudly. He took it, careful not to crush it in his big hands. "You sure this ain't meant for your mama?" Ellie shook her head, curls bouncing. "Nope. Mama says heroes need crowns too." Mara chuckled, leaning in the doorway. "I said no such thing." "Close enough," Jackson said, smiling faintly as he placed the daisy crown on the porch rail beside him. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the smell of pine and earth. It was the kind of silence that didn't hurt anymore. Asterisk 2 weeks later. Jackson came down from the ridge with something bundled in canvas. He laid it on the porch steps. "What's that?" Mara asked. He pulled back the cloth to reveal a small saddle handcrafted, simple, perfect. "For Ellie," he said. "She's outgrown sittin' double with you." Ellie gasped so loud the birds fled the birches. "That's mine?" She squealed. Jackson nodded. "You've earned it." The next morning, the three of them stood in the clearing while Jackson adjusted the stirrups on a gentle mare with white socks. He lifted Ellie up and steadied her reins. "You ride her easy," he said. "She listens best when you're kind." Ellie looked down at him, eyes bright. "Like you?" Jackson chuckled. "Something like that." Mara watched from the porch, her hands clasped in front of her. Ellie's laughter filled the air as she rode in small circles, the sun glinting off her hair. "You've given her something she'll never forget," Mara said quietly. Jackson looked up at her, squinting against the light. "She gave it first," he said. "She gave me reason." When summer reached its height, they were married under the tallest birch. No church, no preacher in robes, just Mayor Calloway, holding his hat awkwardly and reading from a folded paper. The women of Sable Ridge had sewn Mara a simple white dress with lace cuffs, a miracle of effort and thread. It wasn't perfect, but it was more beautiful than anything she'd worn in her life. Jackson wore a clean shirt, his best pair of trousers, and boots polished till they almost shone. His hands trembled when he buttoned his collar that morning. A man unaccustomed to beginnings, Ellie stood between them. Her cheeks flushed, a wreath of daisies on her head, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers. The ceremony was short, but the silence afterward carried more weight than any sermon. Jackson took Mara's hands and spoke quietly, rough voice scraping against words that meant too much. "I thought I died back then," he said. "Stopped breathing when the world burned down. But you and Ellie, you gave me air again. You gave me something worth staying for. And I swear this time I ain't ridden away." Mara pressed her forehead against his, tears spilling freely. "You gave us back the meaning of safe," she whispered. Ellie wrapped her arms around them both, laughing through her tears. The small crowd clapped, cheered, and whistled as the three of them stood together, framed by sunlight and birch leaves. There was no music, just hearts too full to stay quiet. That evening, as the sun dropped low and gold spilled across the hills, 3 horses rode through the open meadow. Jackson, Mara, and Ellie side by side. They rode without destination, without worry, just together. Their laughter rose over the grass and drifted down into the valley, where smoke curled gently from the chimney of a small house by the river. The house they built, the one that wouldn't burn. And sometimes, that's what the Wild West really was, not guns or gold or glory. But the simple act of choosing to stay when running would have been easier. Jackson Clay, Mara Jennings. And little Ellie didn't just survive the frontier. They made it gentle. The wind carried their laughter long after the sun dipped behind the ridges. And if you were to stand there years later, you might still hear it, the echo of love found in a place that never promised it. Because sometimes, even out here where bullets missed and hearts bled quietly, people still found their way home. If this story touched your heart, hit like, share your favorite moment in the comments, and subscribe for more untamed, unforgettable Western love stories from the American frontier. This is Wild West Love Stories, where bullets miss, but hearts never do. Spring faded slowly into summer, the kind of season that crept in so softly you didn't notice until the days were long and the air smelled like grass warmed by the sun. The ridge came alive with color-wild lupine, Indian paintbrush. Yellow daisies that spilled down the slopes like sunlight made the petals dot down by the cabin. Laughter was more common than silence now. Mara's garden grew wild and proud, spilling over its borders. Ellie spent her days running barefoot through the rows of herbs and flowers, a straw hat slipping down her back as she chased grasshoppers or rode her little mare, whom she'd named Clover. Jackson worked near the barn, sleeves rolled, shaping fence rails or patching the roof before the next storm. There was a piece to the rhythm of it: hammer, breath, birdsong, wind. He'd never say it out loud, but every nail he drove into that cabin, every rail he set upright, was a promise. This won't fall. Sometimes Mara would come out with a pail of lemonade and watch him. The sight of that big man working quietly in the fading light, his hands rough but sure, his face softened by a rare kind of calm, did something to her chest she didn't have a word for. She'd once thought safety meant distance. Now she knew it meant someone staying. Sable Ridge, once just a whisper on the map, began to notice the change. The blacksmith, Jed Harlan, often tipped his hat when Jackson rode into town for supplies. "Never thought I'd see the day you'd come in with a smile." "Clay," he'd joke, and Jackson would only shrug, a small grin betraying him before he could hide it. Mara started selling her tonics again, this time not out of necessity, but pride. Folks trusted her hands. They'd stop by her table in the market just to ask about the herbs she used, or to buy a jar they didn't really need just for an excuse to linger in her kindness. And Ellie, well, she became the town's little light. She'd race through the streets, her braids flying, always calling a greeting to whoever she passed. The children adored her, and the grown-ups smiled easier when she was near. Even Sheriff Dunn, a man carved out of law and dust, would doff his hat when she waved. Jackson, Mara teased one afternoon as they walked back from town. "You've gone and raised a celebrity." He chuckled, low and quiet. "That one was born famous. I'm just trying to keep up." She laughed, shaking her head. "You're doing just fine." But peace, as the West often taught, never came without a test dot. It was near the end of summer when word rode in from the south, rumor carried by a ranch hand passing through. Lyle Jennings had escaped custody in Cheyenne. The name hit Jackson like a bullet that didn't bleed. He didn't speak of it, not right away, but Mara saw the shift in him, the way his eyes swept the tree line more often, the way he double-bolted the door at night. "Do you think he'd come here?" she asked one evening, voice tight. Jackson didn't answer at first. He looked out over the hills, toward the old trail that cut through the cedar grove, then back to her. "Men like him don't forget being beaten," he said finally, "but we'll be ready if he tries." That night, he cleaned his rifle twice. The following week, a thunderstorm rolled through the valley, wild and unrestrained. Lightning forked across the sky, and rain slammed against the roof in heavy sheets. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed while the three of them huddled together, Mara mending one of Ellie's dresses, Jackson whittling a bit of wood into a horse, Ellie fighting sleep against her mother's shoulder. "Papa?" she said around a yawn. Jackson looked up. The title hit him like sunlight breaking through clouds. She'd never called him that before. He blinked slowly, rough voice softer than ever when he said, "Yeah, little one? Will we always be here?" He traded a glance with Mara, who smiled faintly over Ellie's head. "As long as this ridge'll have us," he promised. Ellie nodded, content, and drifted into sleep to the sound of rain when her breathing steadied. Mara whispered, "She called you Papa." "I heard," Jackson said, still looking at the child's small face. "Are you all right?" He smiled faintly. "It's been a long time since anyone called me that." Mara reached over, her fingers brushing his. "She's yours now, Jackson." "We both are." He took her hand gently, holding it like something sacred. "Then I reckon the world's finally done talking from me," he said quietly. Outside, thunder rolled, but inside, the fire burned steady. Weeks passed. The ridge settled again into its rhythm work, laughter, quiet evenings. It might have stayed that way forever, if not for the rider who appeared one day. Jackson was in the field when he spotted the silhouette against the rising sun. A single horseman, moving fast, kicking up dust. He rested a hand on his rifle, watching. The rider slowed as he neared, young, nervous, sweat-soaked. "Mr. Clay?" he called out. "Name's Henson. Rode in from Clearwater. There's talk someone askin questions. Man with a bad shoulder, scar on his neck. Said he's looking for a woman and a kid." Mara stepped onto the porch just in time to see Jackson's expression harden. "Lyle," she whispered. Jackson nodded once. "It's him. Then we should leave." "No," he said firmly, eyes locked on the horizon. "We've done enough running. He'll find us or he won't. But if he does—" His gaze dropped to her, steady as stone. "He won't take anything this time." Mara wanted to argue, but she saw it in his face, the quiet certainty of a man who had already decided that fear was no longer welcome here. She turned and went inside to pack supplies anyway. 3 days passed. Nothing. Then, at dusk on the 4th day, a crow's cry shattered the calm. Jackson looked up from the porch just as a dark shape moved through the trees. Lyle. Alone. He wasn't the same man who'd swaggered into the market months before. He looked thinner, eyes wild, mouth twisted in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Clay," he shouted, voice ragged. "You think you can steal what's mine and just live like I don't exist?" Jackson stepped down from the porch, calm but alert. "You ain't anyone's ghost but your own," he said. "Turn around and ride out. No one here wants blood today." Lyle laughed a cracked, ugly sound. "You took my woman, my life. You left me nothing but hate." Jackson shook his head slowly. "No, Lyle, you did that yourself." The outlaw's hand twitched toward his gun. Jackson's voice dropped, low as thunder before a storm. "Don't." For a heartbeat, time held. Then metal flashed. 2 shots cracked through the air, one from Lyle, one from Jackson. Lyle staggered first. The bullet caught his shoulder, spinning him back. His gun fell into the dust. Jackson walked forward, rifle steady, until he stood over him. "It ends here," he said. Lyle looked up, eyes burning even as his strength faded. You think you deserve her? After what you done in the war?" Jackson's jaw clenched. "No man deserves anything. He earns it. I earned her trust. You threw yours away." Lyle tried to speak, but the effort failed. His head slumped forward, breath gone with the wind. Jackson stood there a long time before lowering his gun. When he finally turned, Mara was standing at the edge of the porch, hands shaking but eyes dry. "Is it over?" she asked. Jackson looked past her, up toward the birch trees swaying gently in the breeze. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's over." That night, the 3 of them sat by the fire again. Ellie drew pictures in the dirt, by the hearth flowers, horses, a big stick-figure man with a hat and a smaller one holding his hand. Mara watched her, then looked at Jackson. "You think she'll remember any of this when she's grown?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe not the pain. Maybe just the peace that came after." Mara leaned her head against his shoulder. "That's enough for me." He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain again, but this time it didn't smell like fear. It smelled like life beginning again. Sometimes the West was cruel. It took more than it gave. But for some rare souls, it gave back what mattered most. For Jackson Clay, Mara Jennings, and Ellie the Ridge wasn't just a place to live. It was proof that even in a land built on loss, love could still take root. And once it did, no fire, no storm, no man could burn it away. A week passed after Lyle Jennings was buried on the edge of town, beneath a crooked pine that leaned like a guilty secret. No one said much during the service. Sheriff Dunn read a few words, brief and impersonal, the kind you give to a man who'd run out of second chances. When it was done, the wind scattered dust over the fresh mound, and that was that. The West had a short memory for men like Lyle. Back on the ridge, life resumed its quiet rhythm. The cabin still stood, smoke curling lazily from its chimney each morning. The fence line stretched a little farther every week. Jackson's handiwork straight and true. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, pine resin, and something new peace. Mara hummed as she worked near the hearth, grinding dried herbs into fine powder for her medicine trade. The gentle scrape of the mortar was comforting, a rhythm she'd missed when life had been all flight and fear. Ellie played near the window, sketching with a stub of charcoal on scrap paper. Her drawings had changed lately, less of monsters, more of flowers, horses, people holding hands. Jackson leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, watching them both. The sun poured over his shoulders like molten gold. He'd spent so many years alone, certain the world was finished with him. Yet somehow, in the quiet company of these two souls, life had found a way to whisper back. By mid-autumn, Sable Ridge had become more than just a place they lived. It had become part of them. The townsfolk had started to accept Mara and Ellie fully no longer, whispering about the runaway widow or the stray girl. They simply saw them as the woman who mended wounds and the child who could make even the blacksmith laugh. As for Jackson Clay, well, his reputation had transformed. The stories of the showdown in the forest spread wide and fast. Some called him a hero. Others said he was just a man who'd done what was right. Jackson didn't care either way. He didn't fix fences or rebuild barns for thanks. He did it because work kept his hands busy and his heart steady. Mara noticed, though. She noticed everything. The way he paused before sitting at the table, waiting for Ellie to choose her seat first. The way he never raised his voice, not even when the horse spooked or the roof leaked. The way he carried his scars like old tools, useful reminders of what had already been survived. She'd seen men with strength before, but Jackson Clay's strength wasn't in his shoulders. It was in how he stayed gentle after the world had given him every reason not to. One afternoon, a wagon rattled up the ridge. A familiar voice called out, "Ho there, Clay. You home?" Jackson stepped out to see Jed Harlan, the blacksmith, waving from the driver's bench. The old man had a grin like sunrise. "Brought you something," Jed said, hopping down. He opened the back of the wagon to reveal a sturdy iron stove. "You've been patching that old cook fire too long. Figured the family that saved this town once or twice deserves a decent meal that ain't half ashes." Jackson frowned, caught between gratitude and his lifelong habit of refusing help. "Jed, you didn't have to." "Didn't ask if I had to," Jed cut in. "Now quit jowing and help me carry it in before I'm too old to lift it." Mara appeared in the doorway, hands on her apron. "Mr. Harlan, that's mighty kind of you." Jed winked. "Ma'am, the kindness is for me. Gives me an excuse to come up here and see proof that miracles exist." Mara smiled, cheeks flushing pink. Later that evening, as smoke from the new stove curled up the chimney, the smell of stew filled the cabin. Jackson sat at the table while Ellie chattered about school and her friend Nora, who claimed she'd seen a real bear. Mara laughed softly as she served them each a bowl. The simple things, warm food, lamplight, laughter, these were the riches the frontier rarely offered. And Jackson took them in like a man starved too long. Asterisk that winter, snow came early. Thick and quiet, it blanketed the ridge in white, softening the world. They spent the cold months together like an unspoken pact, Mara sewing quilts by the fire, Ellie teaching Jackson how to play dominoes, Jackson carving small toys out of scrap wood for her collection. Every night, before bed, Ellie would place the wooden horse Jackson had made her on the windowsill, facing the stars, so she can run in her dreams, she said solemnly. Jackson never corrected her. Sometimes, when the wind howled, Mara would wake to find him standing by the window, looking out into the snowstorm. "What do you see out there?" She'd whisper. He'd shake his head, voice low. "Just listening. Wind talks out here. Reminds me that silence ain't emptiness, it's memory." She'd step closer, resting her hand on his arm. "You don't have to listen to ghosts anymore, Jackson." He'd look down at her, eyes soft in the firelight. "Maybe not. But I figure I owe him the courtesy of saying goodbye." And then he'd turn away from the window and back toward the fire toward her. When spring returned, it came fierce and full. The river swelled, wildflowers burst from the thawing earth, and birds filled the air with songs that sounded almost like laughter. One morning, Mara found Jackson outside with Ellie, teaching her how to hammer a nail straight into a fence post. "Steady your wrist," he said, guiding her hand gently. "Don't fight the woodwork with it. Everything worth building takes patience." Ellie squinted, tongue between her teeth, and struck true. The nail sank clean. Jackson grinned, pride shining in his weathered face. "That's my girl." Ellie giggled and flung her arms around him. "You're my papa," she said into his coat. He froze for a second, then knelt and hugged her back, holding tight like the world might try to take her again. "Always," he murmured. "Always will be." Mara stood at the porch, watching them, her eyes stinging with tears she didn't bother to hide. That evening, she walked down to the river alone. The sky had turned to watercolor orange, fading to rose, rose to deep blue. She knelt by the water, cupping a handful of cold current, and whispered a name she hadn't spoken in years. Samuel, her late husband's name, the one she'd loved, buried, and carried like a stone. "I hope you see us now," she said softly. "I hope you know we're safe, that he's good to her, good to me." Behind her, branches cracked softly under a familiar set of boots. Jackson stopped a few feet away, hat in hand. "Didn't mean to intrude. You didn't." She looked over her shoulder at him. "I was just saying goodbye." He stepped closer, crouched beside her. The river shimmered between them. "Goodbyes are heavy," he said quietly, "but they leave room for hellos." Mara smiled through tears. "Then maybe it's time I said both." He took her hand, calloused fingers folding over hers. "You already did." They stayed there until the sun was gone, and the stars began to blink awake, one by one. By summer, Jackson built a new barn on the north side of the property. He hung a lantern by the door that burned every night a small, steady flame that could be seen from the valley below. People started calling it the beacon on Clay Ridge. Travelers passing through would look up at night and swear the light was a sign of mercy in a hard land. For Mara and Ellie, it was home. And for Jackson Clay, the man who'd once believed everything worth loving had burned away, it was proof that even ashes could bloom again. Some nights, when the moon rode high and silver over the hills, he'd sit on the porch while Mara slept and Ellie dreamed, and he'd think about the strange, impossible road that had led him here. War, loss, silence, a little girl's voice in a well. "You need a wife, and I need a dad." He smiled faintly into the dark. "You were right, kid," he whispered. "Guess we both found what we needed." The wind carried the words away over the trees. But somehow he knew they'd been heard. Asterisk by the summer of 1879. Sable Ridge had grown into something almost civilized. A new general store had opened on Main Street. The church got a fresh coat of whitewash, and the blacksmith's hammer was no longer the only heartbeat of the town. Children laughed in the schoolyard. The saloon had fewer brawls. And word was spreading that Sable Ridge was finally turning into a place worth staying. For Mara, Jackson, and Ellie. It already was. Life on the ridge had settled into a quiet rhythm. Mornings filled with chores and the smell of coffee. Afternoons in the garden. Evenings by the fire while Ellie read aloud from a tattered book of frontier stories. Jackson still rose before dawn. His habits too old to break. He'd walk the fence line with his rifle slung across his shoulder, just to see the light come over the valley. Sometimes Mara would join him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders and slipping her arm through his. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to, and Ellie, she was growing fast. Her braids reached her back now, her confidence even farther. She'd started riding Clover all on her own, darting across the meadow with her laughter trailing behind her like ribbons. It was for a time. As close to perfect as the Wild West ever allowed. But perfection has a way of catching someone's eye. It started with a letter. Mara found it nailed to the gatepost one morning. No stamp. No seal. Just rough handwriting in dark ink. To Mr. Jackson Clay. Be advised, land south of Birch Creek is claimed under charter by the Montclair Mining Company. Vacate within 30 days. Mara frowned, reading it twice. She handed it to Jackson when he came in from the barn. He took the paper, scanned it once, and said nothing. "Is it real?" she asked. "Probably," he muttered. "But that don't make it right." The Montclair Mining Company had been buying up land all over the territory. Rich Eastern men who'd never swung a pickaxe in their lives, but knew how to smell profit in the dirt. They'd send surveyors ahead, mark off hillsides, and call them theirs never mind who lived there before. Jackson folded the paper, placed it on the table, and stared at it like it was a rattlesnake. "This ridge ain't for sale," he said finally. Myra's brow furrowed. "Then we'll fight it?" He looked up at her, eyes steady. "We'll stand our ground." She nodded once. "Then we'll stand with you." A week later, riders appeared on the trail below. 3 men in fine coats and bowler hats, their horses too polished for frontier dirt. Jackson met them halfway down the slope. The one in front smiled, all city charm. "Mr. Clay, I presume?" Jackson's silence was answer enough. The man dismounted, brushing dust from his gloves. "Name's Randall Cook, representing Montclair Mining. We've discovered ore deposits in these hills, silver, to be precise. Fine veins of it running right under this ridge." Jackson's eyes flicked to the trees, the cabin just visible through them. "And," Cook smiled wider, "and we're offering fair purchase. $200 for your land and the rights beneath it. That's more money than most folks see in a lifetime, Mr. Clay." Jackson let the words hang in the air a moment. "Then, it ain't for sale." Cook blinked, the smile slipping a little. "Perhaps you didn't understand." Jackson stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "I understood fine. This land's been rebuilt by hand, by sweat and graves. You can tell your company to find silver somewhere else." Cook cleared his throat, straightening his vest. "You're making a mistake. Montclair's backed by the territory office. If you won't sell, they'll take it under charter." Jackson's gaze hardened. "Then they'll have to come dig me up first." Cook swallowed. 30 days, he said quietly. "After that, it won't be a matter for discussion." He turned, mounted his horse, and rode off without another word. The sound of their hooves faded into the valley. Jackson stood there a long time before heading back up the hill. Asterisk that night, Mara found him on the porch, sharpening his axe. A sound of steel on stone echoed through the stillness. "You mean to fight them?" she said softly. He didn't look up. "I mean to stay. Jackson, they're not like Lyle or those men before. These aren't guns, they're laws. Papers, judges in towns far from here." He paused, then met her eyes. "Then I reckon it's time someone reminded them laws don't mean much without people to stand under 'em." Mara knelt beside him, her hand brushing his arm. "Promise me one thing. Name it. If this turns ugly, you walk away. We've lost enough to men who think they can own what's free." He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll do what I can." It wasn't a promise, but it was close enough. Days passed. Word spread. The townsfolk of Sable Ridge didn't take kindly to the idea of outsiders digging up their hills. Mayor Calloway called a town meeting in the church hall, where the air smelled of pine soap and candle smoke. Jackson stood near the back. Hat in hand, the Montclair Mining Company claims territorial charter rights. The mayor announced, reading from a paper. "They've already seized land up by Elk Hollow and the northern ridge. We need to decide, do we yield or do we resist?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Jed Harlan stood up first. "Ain't no man in a bowler hat ever sweated for this dirt. I say we fight, M." A chorus of agreement followed shopkeepers, ranchers, farmers. Mayor Calloway looked uneasy. "Fight them how, Jed? With what? Guns against papers?" That's when Jackson stepped forward. His voice carried easily through the room. "You forget, Mayor, these hills remember more than ink. They remember blood. Men and women worked this land before any company thought to claim it. If we give it up now, we tell every man east of the river he can buy our souls with a silver dollar." Silence fell. Then Jed grinned. "That's Clay talkin'. Guess we got ourselves a leader." Jackson shook his head. "No, you don't need a leader. You need each other. They can buy one man off, but they can't buy a town that stands together." That night, Sable Ridge decided to fight. A week later, the company returned, this time with a dozen men and a wagon full of equipment. But when they reached the base of the ridge, they found something waiting for them. Every man, woman, and child from Sable Ridge stood along the trail. Shoulder to shoulder. Mara and Ellie were there too, standing beside Jackson. The townsfolk had built a barricade of logs and wagons. Nothing fancy, but solid enough to say you're not welcome here. Cook rode to the front, his face pale. "Mr. Clay, this is unlawful obstruction." Jackson cut him off. "And this is our land." Cook's voice trembled now. "The sheriff won't stand for this." Sheriff Dunn stepped forward from the crowd, his badge glinting. "He already is." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Cook cursed, pulled on his reins, and turned his horse. "You've made an enemy of powerful men, Clay," he shouted. Jackson watched them leave, his voice steady when he called back, "Then they'll have to stand in line." That night, the town lit bonfires all along the ridge. Mara stood beside Jackson, watching the flames dance against the dark. The people laughed, sang, and told stories about war and peace, about loss and finding again. Ellie sat in Jackson's lap, head against his chest, her small voice sleepy. "We're safe now, right?" He kissed her hair. "Safe as a soul can be," he said. Mara leaned against him, her eyes glimmering in the firelight. "You've given them more than a home, Jackson. You've given them courage." He shook his head slowly. "Wasn't me. Was them remembering who they are?" She smiled, taking his hand. "Still? You're the reason they remembered." The firelight caught his face, softening the hard lines. For a moment, he looked younger, lighter, like the years of dust and grief had finally begun to fall away. Far down the valley, beyond the light of the ridge, Randall Cook wrote a telegram by lantern glow, his hand shaking. To Montclair Mining CO Head Office, Chicago Re. Sable Ridge claim resistance encountered. LED by former Union officer Jackson Clay. Town stands united. Recommend delay? He hesitated, then added one final line before sending it. These people cannot be bought. Autumn came early that year. The birch leaves along the ridge turned gold and silver, whispering in the cold wind like coins clinking in a banker's pocket. Down in the valley, smoke rose from new camps. The Montclair Mining Company had not given up. They'd only gone quiet long enough to make a louder move. It started with rumors. A foreman seen in the saloon with a stack of cash. A few drifters hired on as guards. Men buying whiskey by the crate. Asking too many questions about Jackson Clay and his family. By the time Sheriff Dunn rode up the ridge to warn him, Jackson already knew. Cook's back? He asked, tightening the strap on his saddle. The sheriff nodded grimly. Him and a dozen hired guns. Says he's got papers territorial writ signed in Helena. Gives Montclair rights to all land west of Birch Creek, including yours. Mara stood in the doorway, shawl clutched tight around her. And the law's gonna let them take it? Dunn sighed, pulling off his hat. Law says what men with ink and money tell it to, Mom. But the people, well, that's another story. Jackson looked past him to the horizon where the valley smoke rose. They're coming, he said simply. The sheriff nodded. Tomorrow. Maybe sooner. Jackson's jaw flexed once. Then they'll find me ready. That night, the ridge didn't sleep. Word spread fast, the way fear does, but this time, it carried something stronger behind it. Resolved. Men rode up with shovels and rifles. Women brought food, lanterns, water. They built barricades across the lower trail, just like before. Only this time they weren't just standing for land, they were standing for home. Jackson and Jed Harlan worked side by side through the night, laying logs and sharpening stakes. Never figured I'd see the day we'd be fighting lawyers, Jed muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Jackson gave a quiet grunt. They bleed same as anyone. Mara and the other women worked in the cabin, tearing sheets into bandages, boiling water. Ellie helped too, her little hands folding cloth squares carefully. Every so often, she'd glance toward the window, where the lanterns outside flickered like small stars on earth. Mama, she whispered, are they gonna hurt us? Mara paused, her throat tight. No, baby. Not while he's here. Ellie nodded, trusting that answer the way only a child could. By dawn, the ridge was wrapped in fog. Jackson stood near the fence line, rifle across his back, watching the mist roll through the trees. The world was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind. The kind of stillness that means the land itself is holding its breath. Then he heard it, the distant clatter of hooves. He turned his head slightly, and Mara appeared beside him, her face pale but calm. They're coming, she said. Stay inside with Ellie. Jackson. He met her eyes, soft but firm. I'll come back. You have my word. She wanted to argue, to hold him there, but something in his voice, the weight of a man who'd already made peace with his own ghost, stopped her. She nodded once and turned away. He watched her go until the door closed behind her. Then he took his position. The company riders emerged from the fog like wraiths. Randall Cook led them, hat tilted low, a folded document clutched in one gloved hand. Behind him came 10 armed men, on horseback mercenaries, with cold eyes and quicker fingers. Cook raised his hand. Mr. Clay. Jackson stood tall on the ridge path, coat fluttering in the wind. You came earlier than I thought. Cook urged his horse forward a few paces. I came to give you one last chance. Leave peacefully, and Montclair will pay you twice the original offer." Jackson's voice carried clear. "I told you before, this land ain't for sale." Cook's jaw tightened. "Then you're trespassing under territorial charter law. I'm authorized to remove you." Jackson looked past him to the armed men. "Remove me, then." The silence stretched thin, and Cook's face twisted with frustration. "Fine, have it your way." He raised his hand. The mercenaries spread out, guns drawn. Jackson waited, still as stone. Then, with a whistle that cut through the air, the townfolk revealed themselves from behind the barricade. Dozens of rifles leveled as one. The mercenaries froze. Cook paled. "You can't." Jackson stepped forward. "You've got law on paper. I've got law in flesh and blood. You take one shot, and this ridge will bury you before you hit the dirt." No one moved. Even the fog seemed to hold still. Cook looked around at the faces of farmers, blacksmiths, women holding shotguns steady as prayer. He swallowed hard, lowering his voice. "You think you've won something here, Clay?" "I ain't thinking," Jackson said. "I know." Cook hesitated, then jerked his reins. "Let's go." The mercenaries turned their horses. The sound of retreating hooves echoed through the valley. Fading like a dying storm, Jackson watched them disappear before finally lowering his rifle. Jed clapped him on the shoulder. "Guess the law just found its backbone." Jackson gave a faint smile. Just needed a reminder where it came from. Asterisk that night, the ridge was alive again. Lanterns burned bright. Laughter rose like music. And someone brought out a fiddle that hadn't been played since before the war. Mara stood by the fire, her shawl slipping from one shoulder, her eyes following Jackson as he helped repair the barricade. He moved slower now, tired, but every step was steady. When he finally returned to her, she placed a hand against his chest. "You did it." He shook his head. "We did." Ellie came running from the crowd, her curls bouncing. "Papa, Papa." "They're saying you scared 'em all away." Jackson lifted her into his arms, laughing quietly. "Scared? Maybe, but I think they just remembered what real people look like." She giggled, tugging at his beard. "Mama says you're the strongest man alive." He looked at Mara, eyes warm. "She gives me reason to be." Later, when the fires burned low and the town drifted to sleep, Jackson stood at the edge of the ridge. Looking out over the dark valley, Mara joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist. The night air was crisp, stars sharp and cold above them. "They'll be back, won't they?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Maybe not Cook, but men like him don't quit easy." "Then what do we do?" He looked down at her, his voice steady and certain. "We keep living. That's how you win out here, not by shooting, not by shouting. By living longer than the hate." Mara rested her head against his shoulder. "Then we'll live, Jackson, together." He smiled faintly. "That's the only promise worth keeping." They stood there until the first streaks of dawn brushed the sky pink and gold. The valley below glimmering like it had forgiven them for daring to survive. Weeks later, a letter arrived. This time, it bore an official seal from Helena. Jackson opened it at the table while Mara and Ellie watched. His eyes moved across the page. Then he exhaled slowly. "What is it?" Mara asked. He handed it to her. "The governor's office. They've rescinded the Montclair charter. Looks like word got out about their methods." She smiled, eyes wide. "Then it's over?" He nodded. "For now." Ellie clapped her hands. "We won." Jackson chuckled softly, pulling her onto his lap. "No, darling. We didn't win. We just stayed." Mara met his gaze, her smile soft and knowing. "Sometimes that's the same thing." That night, as the wind swept through the birch trees, Jackson sat on the porch alone. The stars shimmered bright above, and for a long time he said nothing. Then, quietly, he murmured to the dark, "You see that, June? We built something worth keeping." The wind sighed through the leaves as if answering. He leaned back, closing his eyes, listening to the laughter of Mara and Ellie drifting from inside the cabin. The sound of a home dot, and for the first time in a lifetime, Jackson Clay allowed himself to believe that the past no longer owned him. The years rolled on like the slow bend of a river, sometimes quiet, sometimes wild, but always moving forward. By 1883, the ridge looked different. The trees had grown taller. The house had been painted a soft cream, and a swing hung from the porch beam where Ellie liked to read. Chickens pecked lazily in the yard. The barn had a fresh roof. The kind that didn't leak when it rained. Time had left its mark on Jackson Clay, too. His hair was grayer now, his beard silvering around the chin, but his eyes still burned the same steady blue. He'd grown into the kind of man the frontier rarely allowed, a man at peace. Mara said he looked wiser, though he'd laugh and tell her that was just another word for tired. But she knew better. He wasn't tired. He was full the way a field feels after the harvest, spent but rich. And Ellie, no longer a child, had become the brightest thing on the ridge. At 16, she rode Clover bareback across the meadows, her laughter chasing the wind. Her hair had turned sun gold, and her spirit was something Jackson recognized all too well, wild, loyal, and brave enough to stare down any storm. He watched her sometimes from the porch, and when she caught him looking, she'd grin and call, "Stop staring. Papa, you'll make me nervous." "Just making sure you ain't running off with some fool," he'd reply. But his smile always gave him away. Mara would roll her eyes. "You sound like a man twice your age." He'd glance at her with that quiet smirk. "You make getting old worth it." And just like that, she'd blush after all these years. Still as if he'd said something scandalous. Sable Ridge had changed. 2. The town had a real post office now, and the general store had doubled in size. The church bell rang every Sunday, and laughter spilled from the saloon every night. Folks still told stories about the standoff on the ridge, how Jackson Clay had faced down the mining company and sent them packing. They told it like legend now, the kind of tale that grew taller with each telling. But for Jackson, it was never about the fight. It was about what came after. The quiet, the rebuilding, the life. That was the victory. One crisp morning, a letter arrived with a government seal. Jackson broke it open at the table, eyes narrowing at the official print. Mara looked up from kneading bread. "Bad news?" He shook his head slowly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Seems they're finally doing something right. Governor signed the new homestead charter. This land's ours for good. Legal, proper, and permanent." Mara's hands froze mid-motion. After all these years? After all these years. She let out a soft laugh, half disbelieving, half relieved. "Then we've truly done it, haven't we?" Jackson nodded, folding the letter neatly. "We have." Ellie burst through the door just then, cheeks pink from the morning ride. "What's going on?" Mara smiled through happy tears. "The ridge is ours, sweetheart. No one can take it from us." Ellie whooped loud enough to startle the hens outside. "Then we should have a celebration." Jackson chuckled. "Ain't that what supper's for?" She put her hands on her hips, grinning. "Not just supper. A dance. Everyone from town." Mara laughed. "Oh, Lord, she's got your stubbornness." Jackson tipped his hat. "I take that as a compliment." A week later, lanterns glowed all across the ridge. The townsfolk came on wagons, horseback and foot bringing pies, cider, fiddles, and laughter that carried clear to the stars. The air smelled of wood smoke, and roasted apples. Jed Harlan strung up fairy lights between the birch trees. Sheriff Dunn, now gray and rounder than he used to be, stood by the bonfire nursing a tin cup of whiskey. And in the middle of it all, Mara Clay wore a soft blue dress that shimmered in the firelight, her hair pinned with a single white flower. When Jackson saw her, he forgot for a moment that decades had passed. She looked just like she had the night she first stood on his porch, strong, scared, beautiful beyond reason. He walked up, offering his hand. "May I?" She smiled, slipping her fingers into his. "After all these years, you still remember how?" "I remember everything," he said quietly. They danced slow to the fiddle's tune. Around them, the town cheered and clapped. But Jackson only saw her, the way her eyes shone when she laughed, the warmth of her hand against his chest, the life they had built from dust and ashes. For a man who'd once lost everything, this was more than heaven. It was redemption. Later that night, as the fire burned low, Jackson sat on the porch watching the lanterns flicker out one by one. Ellie joined him, barefoot, her hair loose from its braid. "They say Mr. Cook's company went under," she said softly. "Guess the world caught up to him." Jackson nodded. "World always catches up. Just takes time." She looked out at the hills. "I've been thinking." He raised an eyebrow. "That's never good." She laughed. "I want to go east. Study medicine. Like Mama used to do before." He didn't answer right away. His fingers tapped the arm of the chair. "That's a long road, Ellie." "I know. But I want to help people, Papa, the way she does. The way you did." He looked at her then, really looked, and saw not the little girl he'd found years ago by that creek, but a young woman, brave and determined, just like her mother. He swallowed hard. "Then you go. And you don't look back unless it's to see how proud we are." She smiled through misty eyes. "You mean it?" He reached over, cupping her cheek. "I mean it." Mara watched from the doorway, her heart both breaking and soaring at once. Spring came again, gentle this time. Ellie left on a clear morning, the sun spilling over the hills like blessing light. She hugged them both tight before mounting her horse. "I'll write every week," she promised. "You'd better," Jackson said, trying not to show the tears gathering in his eyes. "Or I'll come fetch you myself." She laughed, turning her horse toward the road. "Love you, Papa. Love you too, little one." They watched until she disappeared down the valley trail. Mara slipped her arm through his. "You think she'll be all right?" He nodded slowly. "She's got both our fires in her. That's all she ever need." They stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at their clothes, the sound of birds rising from the trees. Years passed again. By 1890, Jackson's hair was white. His hands, once steady as stone, trembled a little when he worked the fields. But he still rose early, walked the fence line, and tended the land that had once nearly been taken from him. Ellie wrote often, letters full of stories about her work in Prescott, about the patients she treated, about the life she was building. Every one of them ended the same way. "Tell Mama I love her. Tell Papa the ridge is still my heart." Mara would read them aloud, her voice catching on the last line every time. On the morning of their 20th anniversary, Jackson built a small bench beneath the birch tree where they'd said their vows. The wood was rough, simple, honest like everything they'd ever done. That evening, he and Mara sat side by side, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft gold and crimson. "Remember when you said you'd build something that wouldn't burn down?" she asked, smiling. He nodded. "Guess I kept my word." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You did more than that, Jackson Clay. You built a life worth staying for." He squeezed her hand gently. "And you made it worth living. The ridge never forgot them. Long after their time, folks still told the story of the man who stood against the miners, of the woman who healed with her hands and her heart, and of the child who brought them both back to life. They called it The Ridge That Stood, a tale of love, land, and the stubborn courage of people who refused to be broken. And when the wind blew through the birch trees, locals swore they could still hear it, the laughter of a family that once made the Wild West gentle.